I'm thrilled to be here. This is one of my heroes, one of the great theater people in America. Welcome to Uptown.
Thank you. The log rolling is supposed to go the other way, though, David. This is, those of you who haven't read this yet, this is an absolutely wonderful book and a consistently surprising book for me. In a way, the title says exactly what the book is doing, which is trying to give us help in knowing other people and knowing them deeply. You say right at the beginning that the importance of this practice is, among other things, for reasons of national survival. And I'd love to have you talk about what you mean by that.
Yeah, there's a personal reason. All of us writers are working out our shit in public. And so there's a personal reason why I wrote the book, which we can talk about later. But there's a public reason, which is that our country's in the middle of some sort of weird social and relational breakdown. Right. And so we all know those statistics on rising mental health problems, rising suicide. Some of the ones that are jarring for me is the number of high school students who say they're persistently hopeless and despondent is up to 45%. The number of Americans who say they have no close personal friends is up by fourfold since 2000. The number of Americans who have no romantic partner is up by a third. The amount of time we spend with our friends is up by 60%. I could just go on and on.
Wow.
And so we've just become sad. And a sad country becomes a mean country. Because when you feel yourself invisible, not seen, there's nothing crueler than treating somebody with indifference, that they're not there. And they regard it as an injustice, which it is, so they want to lash out. And so the sad statistics are matched by mean statistics, and I won't reel them off, but hate crimes, gun violence, the polarization in our politics. My wife and I have a favorite restaurant on Central Park South named Gabriel's. And Gabriel told us a couple years ago that he has to throw people out of the restaurant on a weekly basis because they're rude. Wow. And that never used to happen.
Wow.
And so the sadness and the meanness can only be solved by, frankly, by vulnerability, by actually seeing the other person, being vulnerable and open. And it's super hard to be vulnerable at a time like this. And you will be betrayed if you're vulnerable. But in my view, it's not naive to lead with trust. It's not naive to lead with curiosity. It's the most aggressively effective way to counter the social malady all around us.
What you refer to at one point as an epidemic of loneliness, which is caused by an epidemic of blindness. And that's what you mean by not...
Yeah, I mean, if you think of the book was partly influenced by Ralph Ellison's great book, Invisible Man. And he says on the very first page of that book, when people look at me, they see everything but me. They see the stereotypes they have of me. They see my surroundings, but they don't see me. And in his case, it's because of race. But in my job as a journalist, people are constantly telling me they feel unseen. So you're from Minnesota. So when I used to go out to the Midwest, about once a day, somebody would say, "You guys think we're just flyover country." I hear that 10 times a day. Right. And so it's blacks feeling that whites don't see their daily experience, Republicans and Democrats looking at each other in blind incomprehension, lonely teenagers feeling nobody knows them, husband and wives in broken marriages, realizing the person who should know them the best has no clue who they are. And so I guess I'd ask you in the audience, how good are you at seeing others? And I haven't met most of you, but I can say with great confidence, you're not as good as you think you are. And that there's a researcher in the University of Texas who studies how much people understand when we're talking, how much am I understanding what's going on in your head. And the average person is right about 20% of the time. Wow. And some people are pretty good, they're 55%. Some people are 0, but they think they're 100.
Right, right.
And actually, this guy's, I don't really believe this, but one of his findings is that as couples are married longer, they understand each other less well. Because they form, when they first fall in love, they form a model of who that person is.
Right, right.
And then over the years, the person changes and they haven't updated their models. And so I don't know if I quite believe that, but I do believe it's harder than you think to understand the person right in front of you.
You make a reference in the book to a practice, I believe it was at the New Year that somebody suggested, of writing out the last year from your spouse's point of view.
Yeah.
What was the last year like for your spouse, and then exchanging them.
Yeah.
That was a wonderful idea.
And my wife Ann's here, she had her birthday the other day, and I wrote her a little memo about her year. Totally paid off, totally free birthday present.
I'm sorry, I can't resist. You said there was a personal reason you wrote this book that you were going to tell me about later. Are you willing to share it with me?
Sure. I mean, this is my 20th time on this stage. I learned tonight, and so you guys have heard all my stories. But I open the book by saying, if you remember this movie, Fiddler on the Roof, which I hope you all do, you know how warm and huggy Jewish families can be, always dancing and so I come from the other kind of Jewish family, and so the culture in our family was think Yiddish, act British, and so it was like super stiff upper lip, reserved, and we were sort of intellectuals. My parents were New York Jewish intellectuals, I guess, and so at the dinner table we had long conversations about the history of Victorian funerary monuments, the evolutionary roots of lactose intolerance, and then I want to become a writer, which is a bit of a solitary profession, and that's sort of encompassed my whole life. In high school, I wanted to date this woman named Bernice, and she didn't want to date me. She wanted to date some other guy, and I remember thinking, what is she thinking? I write way better than that guy. And so those were my values, but not hers. And then, so I'm living up in my head, and then when I was 18, the admissions officers at Columbia, Wesleyan and Brown decided I should go to the University of Chicago. And that too is very cerebral. Yeah. And so I love this line, the best saying about Chicago, it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. And so very cerebral, and I fit right in. I was a double major at Chicago in history and celibacy while I was there.
I can see the one-man show coming. It's very good.
But so I was sort of aloof and reserved. And so there's one episode that symbolizes to me that style of life, which was, I love baseball. I've been to 1 million games. I'm a big Mets fan. Feel sorry for me now. But I've never caught a foul ball. And so I'm at a game, and the batter loses control of his bat. It flies in the air and lands in my lap. Wow. And getting a bat is 1,000 times better than getting a ball. And so any normal human being would be jumping up and down, waving his trophy, high-fiving, hugging everybody, getting on the Jumbotron. I took the bat, put it on the floor, and I just stared straight ahead. I had the emotional reaction of a head of lettuce. And I look back on that guy, and I think, show a little joy. And so that was someone who was not too conversant in his own emotions. And that's when Oskar entered my life. So I tell this story in the book. I get invited to go on a panel discussion at the Public Theater. And I'm on a lot of panel discussions, usually in Washington, on the fascinating subject of like budget reform and fiscal policy going into the 21st century. I get to the public, and we're backstage, and there's all these theater people all around, and before the panel, we do a big group hug, and then there's they're all cheering each other's on, and there's a famous actress, Anne Hathaway, is on the panel, and a great clown named Bill Irwin. Yeah. And we're and then we all charge out, and Anne sings a song, and there's tissues on the table in case we start crying, and then people start emoting, and they're sharing their feelings, and I joke that I actually started emoting, and as Samuel Johnson would have said, it was like watching a walrus try to figure skate. It was impressive. Not good, but you were impressed you were seeing it at all.
Exactly.
And then we get done, and we have another group hug, and we all charge off the stage. And I thought, I got to spend more time with theater people. And so I think that was my emotional glasnost, and I've been crying ever since, thanks to you.
Thank you. I don't take credit, but what I do remember, David, we were back there just talking about how we've known each other, and this isn't came up, but something for me really changed about 4 years ago. We were at a dinner party, and a few years before that, we'd been on a panel with Justice Sotomayor in D.C., and you and I had kind of gotten into a fight. You had said something, and I disagreed with it, and we'd fought with each other. And at this dinner party, you just looked at me and said, "Do you remember that panel we were on?" And I was kind of taken aback, because normally people don't call back to fights. And I said, "Well, of course I do." And you said, "I just want you to know that I didn't believe everything I said at first, is that I was saying it because the panel was so boring that I thought that I needed to stir some things up. But you didn't say it in a way to make a joke. You know, what I could tell is that you were actually worried that I didn't know you, and that you wanted me to know better who you were. And I was just flabbergasted. That had never happened to me. And so for me, I date our friendship really from that moment. That was the moment I just went, oh, this is a man I like. And now I realize you were just practicing for the book.
It was all rehearsal. You know, it's funny you say that. We were on this panel, and it was Oskar and Sandra Sotomayor. That's a good panel. And the moderator was not doing a good job, so I decided, okay, I'm going to piss them both off. And if my memory serves, I said to you, you know, theater people shouldn't do politics. They should do something else.
That's right.
And I said to Sandra Sotomayor, I was like, you're a judge. You don't do empathy. And like I was like hitting every red. And so they exploded at me. But as you were saying that, it was a lesson I learned. I taught for about 20 years off and on at Yale, because I only teach at schools I couldn't have gotten into. And so one year, and because I was only up in New Haven one night, I had my office hours at a bar between 9:30 and 1 in the morning. That was how I did it. Not allowed today, by the way. And I was courting a woman, and she said, I'm going to come up to New Haven to tell you if I can marry you or not. And so I didn't tell that to the class, but I said to my class, I'm going to have to cancel office hours because I've just got something personal going on.
Yeah.
And that night, I got about 24 or 25 emails from my students saying, Professor Brooks, I just want you to know I'm thinking of you, I'm praying for you. And it changed the tenor of the whole term. Sure. It wasn't a big show of vulnerability. It was just like a little, I'm going through something. And suddenly I wasn't Professor Brooks. I was just a guy going through life. And it was a lesson in, if you're an employer, if you're in some sort of authority position, you don't want to show total vulnerability, but just a little. And it can change the whole atmosphere of the organization. And the woman came to New Haven and told me she could never marry me. And now she's sitting somewhere in this audience because she's my wife.
Well, I feel absolutely no sympathy about your marital life, because it seems just fine to me.
It's good now.
And, you know, and actually, you know, I feel like in the conversations we've had since then, and also with Anne, there is always this quality. I can tell you're doing something that's different than most people that I talk to. You are trying to listen in a different way. And part of what you write about in this book is just how to do that. And I wonder if you could talk some about that practice.
Yeah, so the book is subtitled The Art of Seeing Others and Being Deeply Seen, but it should accurately be The Art of Hearing Others and Being Deeply Heard. Because most of what when we want to know each other, most of what we're doing is listening.
Yeah.
And so, or being great conversationalists. And again, I'll ask the group, how good are you at conversation? And I will tell you, you're not as good as you think you are. And so I ask conversation experts, tell me about how to get better at conversation. And so I asked them to give me some tips. And so some of them are tips like treat attention as an on-off switch, not a dimmer. If you're in conversation with somebody, make it 100% or 0%. Don't try to 60% it.
Right.
Another is be a loud listener. And so I've got a buddy, when you talk to him, it's like talking to a Pentecostal church. He's like, yes, yes, amen, amen, preach that, preach that. Just love talking to that guy. Another one, which really resonated with people, though, when I was writing it, I didn't think it was that resonant, but don't be a topper. So if you say, I've just had a terrible flight, I was sitting on the tarmac for 2 hours, and I say, I know exactly what you're going through. I just had a terrible flight, I was sitting on the tarmac for 8 hours. It sounds like I'm trying to relate to you, but what I'm really doing is saying, let's stop talking about you, let's start talking about me and my superior experiences. And so these are...
Suddenly really sorry that my wife is in the audience listening to this. I feel so exposed.
Yeah.
Continue.
Yeah. And then finally, the quality of your conversations will be determined by the quality of your questions. And so I know that everybody in this room was once phenomenal at asking questions, because everyone in this room was current or former children. And kids are just great at question askers. And I have a friend here in New York named Naomi Way. He teaches at NYU, but she also has a school for 7th grade boys. And one day she was teaching them, how do you ask good questions? And she said, okay, first day of class, I'm going to sit in the front of the room. You ask me questions. I'll give you an honest answer. And so the first question is, are you married? She says, no. Second question is, are you divorced? She says, yes. Third question is, do you still love him? She's like, whoa, where did that come from? And tears come to her eyes, and she says, yes. And the next question is, does he know? Do your kids know? Kids are just phenomenal question askers. But as we get older, we get less good at it. I think we're shy, we're diffident, we get less curious. I sometimes leave a party and think, that whole time nobody asked me a question.
Yeah.
And I think only about 30 or 40% of the people are really good at question asking. And the quality of a good question, the ones that you do in the beginning are just like, where are you from, just to get to know each other. And then you can get a little more whimsical, like, tell me your favorite unimportant thing about you. And so I learned from a theologian friend of mine that he watches a lot of reality, trashy TV. That's his favorite unimportant thing. For me, it's the fact that I like early Taylor Swift better than later Taylor Swift. I can't remember high school, but I still am moved by high school breakup songs. But then you get to the big questions. And those are questions like, if this 5 years is a chapter in your life, what's the chapter about? If we met a year from now, what would we be celebrating? Or how do your ancestors show up in your life? We're all molded by the people who came before and shaped how we see the world. And these are questions, the nice thing about these questions is there's no definite answer. It's something people have a vague sense, though I know I was shaped by my ancestry, but how? And then you got to think it through. And so then you're having an exploration. And a good conversation is not two people making statements at each other, it's two people having an exploration of a subject.
Right. And do you feel like you've succeeded in getting better at this?
I do. My wife who's here, who says writing this book has changed me. And maybe not like overnight, like you change gradually. But it used to be if you had come up to me and asked me about a problem in your life, I would have panicked or I would have frozen because I wouldn't know what to say.
Right.
And now I think I'm a little more comfortable with that. Yeah. A couple of years ago, I was at a conference and they handed out song sheets, lyrics to a love song. And the person at the conference said, okay, find some stranger in the crowd and sing this love song into this stranger's eyes. And if you had given me this 10 years ago, I would have spontaneously combusted. I could not. But I did it. I can now do it. And I mentioned in the book that I can prove that I've changed, but I have to do name dropping as if Anne Hathaway wasn't enough. So I was interviewed twice by Oprah. And the second time was in 2019. And after the interview, she pulls me aside and says, David, I rarely see someone change so much in middle age. You were so emotionally blocked before. And she's Oprah, so she should know. And so that was actually a good moment for me, that you really can change at any age.
And that's actually a subject you talk about in the book, that we have this notion that we're immutable, that we're somehow frozen into who we are. But you both quote scientific evidence and emotional evidence. That's not true.
Yeah, one of my favorite little vignettes in the book is there's a thing called the Grant Study, where they started Harvard men in the 40s and they studied them for the whole rest of their lives. And so they interviewed them every couple of years, extensive, long interview process every few years. And there was a guy named Andrew Newman who was a total prig, and he was rigid, and nobody really liked him. And when he became a parent, his kids thought he was a perfectionist monster. And then about 50, he's working in the defense industry. At 50, he suddenly has this notion that the world's poor are the responsibility of the world's rich. So he quits his job, and he moves to Sudan and helps farmers do data analytics. And then he comes back, and he becomes a community college teacher and then sort of an urban planner in Texas. And the researchers are interviewing him in his 60s, and he gives them a big Texas hug when he get there. And one of them wrote, I was just transfixed by this guy. Yeah. And so when he's in his 60s, they send him the interview transcripts of his interviews when he was at Harvard, like 20. Right. And they send it to him, and he sends them back, and he said, you sent the wrong guy's interview transcripts. This was not me. I had none of these opinions. I had none of these experiences. It was nothing like me. And they said, no, that was you. But he had reinvented his past. He had changed so much. He couldn't imagine the guy he used to be. And so it was a shock to him. But the good news is it's never too late to turn over a new leaf.
And you talk about, you quote our friend Neil Seth, talking about how actual reality is more influenced by how we view it than by what it is. It's an active act of our perception.
Yeah, like it feels, and this is why it's so important to ask people questions, because we're under the illusion that the world looks the same to all of us. Right. But the world looks radically different to all of us, because perception, it feels like you open your eyes, light comes in, it gets registered like an old-fashioned camera with film. But as Neil Seth, this great neuroscientist, writes, among many others, that's not how perception works. You would be completely overwhelmed with data if you tried to do that. And so what the brain does is it projects out predictions of what it expects to see. Mm-hmm. And then the eyes check back to see if the prediction was correct. So as Seth says, perception is a controlled hallucination. And you can see how radical this is. Probably a lot of you have gone on YouTube and seen the famous gorilla experiment. So people are passing around basketball, and people watch the video and are asked to count the number of passes. And then after the video, they say, "Did you see the gorilla?" And they say, "What are you talking about?" And they say, "Watch it again." And they see there's a guy in a gorilla suit who walks to the middle of the game, waves his arms, and walks off. And they didn't predict gorilla, so they didn't see gorilla. Yeah. If you don't predict it, you will not see it. So another example, my favorite version of this, is there's a kid on college campus who's really a researcher asking another kid directions to a building. And while the directions asker is receiving directions, two workmen who are also researchers carry a door between the two of them. And the directions asker picks up the door and walks away on the other side of the door, hidden behind the door, yeah. And one of the workmen suddenly is standing there. So the directions giver is giving his directions to an entirely different human being. And most of the time they do not notice, because we do not predict the one human being is going to turn into another.
That's astonishing.
And the other little thing, this is from a neuroscientist named Lisa Feldman Barrett. We see, I think it's 7-banded rainbows, but we English speakers. In Russia, there are 2 different words for blue, light blue and dark blue. And so they see an 8-banded rainbow. Wow. And so you can't see what's not in your head. Right. And so I think it's a powerful lesson, because it shows how subjective we are. Right. That we are artists. We're all artists creating, and I think the greatest thing any human being does is create their own unique way of seeing the world. Mm. We take the hurts of our life, the things we've learned, the artistic experiences we've had, and we create a series of models of reality. Right. And so if I want to get to know you, I don't want to know what happened to you. I want to know what you did with what happened to you. Right. I want to be in your subjective layer. And one of the things I love the theater and the arts in general is that's the education of the emotions. Right, right. That if you go to read a play or read a poem or go to the Metropolitan, you haven't necessarily learned a new fact, but you've had a new emotional experience. Mm. And you've widened your repertoire of emotions. And that makes you able to see the world hopefully more graciously and more loving. So I would ask you if theater people are more gracious and more loving than the rest of us. I don't know if that's true. I wouldn't answer that in public. But no, there's certain aspects in which that's true. There are beautiful things. There's also, I like to think it's because of the difficulties of the profession. There's enormous pettiness, rage, competitiveness, all the rest. But what I think most of us would agree on is that what we love about the rehearsal room is that we all become better versions of ourselves when we're actually working together. And that feeling of all of that pettiness dropping away and being able to come to a better version of yourself is addictive. Yeah, and I would say, I mean, there's academic research. The number one way to get your kid be more empathetic is to get them involved in the drama program at school. That's right. Because you're playing with others. And I would say, in researching this book, I talked to a lot of neuroscientists, I talked to cognitive scientists, therapists. The best interviews I had were with actors. Mm. And so one of them was, I've got to do another name dropping, I hate myself. So I interviewed Matthew McConaughey. I was having lunch with the Pope, and then I had to interrupt. But so he says to me, I asked him, how do you get into a role? And he says, first I take the one piece of the character that is a little like something I have inside, and I expand outward. Right. And then he says, I look for some gesture that symbolizes the person. And so he said, once I played a guy who was a hands in the front pocket kind of guy. So he was sort of hunched over. Right. So when he said that, I'm thinking of like Richard Nixon or something like that. And then he says, so I know that guy when he tries to be assertive, he's going to be fake and he's going to overdo it. And so it was just that one little physical gesture that's an insight into a whole character. And then he says to me, when I'm playing a killer, killers aren't thinking to themselves, I'm a killer. They're thinking to themselves, I'm here to restore order. And so I've got to get that into the mind of his head. So he really is, they were very articulate about first how to identify the core of a character, and then B, how to embody it.
Yeah. I mean, you've heard me say that I don't think it's a coincidence that drama and democracy were invented in the same city, in the same decade. Right. And it's because I think that the drama is a laboratory for citizenship, not only doing it, but watching it, because you're practicing empathizing with people who are different than you. Yeah. And you're also seeing something where nobody has the truth. If anybody has the truth, it's a bad play. Yeah. The truth comes from the conflict of different points of view. And if you can accept that, you're a better democratic citizen.
Yeah, I found that so germane, actually, since October 7th, because the Greek city-states were in a state of constant war with one another.
Right.
And so they're doing tragedies. They don't only do tragedies, but they really do a lot of tragedies. And so the tragedies, A, teach you that the crust of civilization is thin. They teach you some sense of humility, that we're not really as much in control of our destinies as we think. Mm. They teach you to suspect rage, because a lot of the characters, when they're raging, they're at their dumbest.
Right.
And then finally, they do teach empathy. I mean, Aeschylus fights, I think, in the Battle of Marathon, and then single-digit years later, he writes a play called The Persians, which is told from the enemy's point of view.
That's right.
And that's kind of astonishing that he was able to do that, but he's like, yeah, we're brothers here in the suffering at some level.
It's the oldest surviving play we have. It's the first manuscript we have. And the only things we know for sure is that it won no prizes that year, because we have the name of one of the prizes, but that it made such an impression that enough people wrote it down and passed it down that it survived the burning of the Library of Alexandria, and it's one of the 38 Greek tragedies that's come down to us out of thousands. Yeah. And in that, what I love about the Persians is it's first of all, you empathize with the enemy, which is a daring thing to do 8 years after this war. But also, he's saying, look who 8 years ago was sure that their empire would last forever. Mm-hmm. Look who was sure that God was on their side and that they could never lose. And that warning about self-regard just sings out of the play.
Yeah. And it's a counsel to humility and caution, I think, for any nation or for any people. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. You write, as a society, we've failed to teach the skills and cultivate the inclination to treat each other with kindness, generosity, and respect. And you actually sort of locate that in the book as a post-World War II phenomena, that we've given up on trying to educate. Could you talk some more about that?
Yeah, so our founders founded this country with a realistic view of human nature. They thought humans are good at cooperating, but we're also kind of selfish, or as they would have said, sinful. And they said, so if we're going to create democracy out of these people, we need to do moral formation. And moral formation sounds like a pompous word, which is a phrase, but it's really about three simple things. First, it's about finding ways to restrain your selfishness. Second, it's about finding some ideal and that you can serve and dedicate your life to. And third, it's about being considerate in the concrete circumstances of life. And so to me, that third thing is really what this book is about, how to be considerate in the concrete circumstances of life. How do you break up with somebody without crushing their heart? How do you critique somebody who's working for you in a caring way? How to host a dinner party so everybody feels involved? Right. How to end a conversation gracefully? Right. You know, this was a skill I lacked. I remember my high school reunion, my 5th reunion. I didn't know how to end a conversation gracefully except to say, oh, I got to go get a drink. So within 20 minutes, I was so drunk out of my mind, I had to leave. But you know, I have a student who said, I had my boyfriends, I've had a few boyfriends in my life, they broke up with me, in each case, by ghosting me. They didn't know how to have that conversation to say, I'm sorry, this is not working, we need to break up. And so they just vanished. Yeah. And so what the founders did in every generation, for the first 150 years of our country, they found ways to do this thing called moral formation. And some were religious, and some were secular, some were, you would say, conservative, some were progressive. They were all kinds of things. And powerfully, schools thought this. They thought their primary job was to teach people character. And so there's a school called the Stowe School, and the headmaster said, we try to produce students who are acceptable at a dance, invaluable at a shipwreck. So the kind of people you can count on. And they thought that was their main job.
Yeah.
And then around 1946, we finished World War II, and there's a book that rests atop the New York Times bestseller list for 52 weeks called Peace of Mind by a guy named Joshua Liebman, I think. Don't hold me to that. And it says, people are not sinful, they're basically good. People are good. And then The Power of Positive Thinking comes out. There's a whole series of books that say people are not selfish. You don't have to work on your character, you just have to get in touch with you. You do you. And so if you think you're already perfect, you don't need to do moral formation because you're already good. And so in my view, we stopped teaching these skills. And I would not want to go back to the way they were taught in centuries past. They were gendered, they were reactionary, there were all sorts of bad problems. But I was inspired in this book by 3 women, and it's no accident they're women. The first is Simone Weil, who was a spiritual writer in World War II, died during World War II. And she says the essential moral act is attention.
Right.
It's how I pay attention to you.
Right.
And Simone Weil influenced Iris Murdoch, the novelist and a philosopher, who said, normally we go through the world with selfish eyes. How can I use you? What can I get out of this circumstance? And the art of becoming a better person is the art of getting out of your own selfishness and seeing the world as it really is. And so she says our goal here should be to cast what she calls a just and loving attention.
She said the quote you had, the essential immoral act is the inability to see each other correctly.
Yeah. And so to me, it's no accident these are women. Like, moral philosophy has existed, obviously, for thousands of years, most of the time dominated by men. And they create, like Immanuel Kant, they create these vast moral systems that are impregnable to argument, and they're a little abstract. And in my view, they were blind to the systems of care that were all around them, that were actually being run by women primarily. And so along comes Simone Weil and Iris Murdoch and a woman named Nell Noddings who wrote about care, a care ethos. And so they say, no, morality is not this big thing that happens on the mountaintops. It's how we treat each other every second of every day. And so it's being a genius at small acts.
You know, a few years ago, I saw a really beautiful debate between Robert Putnam and Charles Murray. And they agreed in advance that they would divide the debate in half. And in the first part of the debate, they would describe what they saw as the problem with our modern society. And they saw exactly the same thing. And then the second half of the debate, they discussed what the causes were. Yeah. And they couldn't have been more opposed. So I completely agree with you. We've got a big problem. But you think it's because we got too soft? And
no, I wouldn't say that.
But in some way, it's because we didn't put the strictures on ourselves of recognizing that our bad passions need to be controlled. I'm sorry, I don't want to put words in your mouth there.
Yeah, I would say we didn't get soft enough. But I would say, so if you, like this, all those statistics I quoted a little while ago, why? And so you could tell a bunch of stories, and I think I would agree on all these stories. And so one of the stories would be the technology story. Social media is driving us all crazy.
Right.
The second story would be the sociology story, which is Bob Putnam's story. We're less active in civic life.
Right.
And so we have less relationships.
Yep.
You could tell an economic story. We're becoming grossly more unequal, and therefore we don't have much overlap in our lives.
Right.
And I agree with that story. You could tell a racial story. We're becoming a much more diverse society. Yep. It's a lot easier to see and be seen if you're surrounded by people just like you.
Right.
And so I would say our social skills are now inadequate to the wonderfully pluralistic society we live in.
Right.
And so I agree with all those stories.
Right.
But to me, if you're looking for a solution, the one other story, which I haven't seen anybody write about this. In my view, more people lived in extended families. And so you had your crazy Uncle Don you had to deal with. Right. And so there was just more social encounters with crazy Uncle Don, so you learned a few things. But to me, the other story is this lack of moral formation. The way I would put it is failure to teach basic skills. Like I saw a study that came out since the book came out, the number of young men who've never asked anybody out on a date. It's super high, and they want to figure out why. And it turns out the young men suck at flirting. Like they don't know how to do it. They do not know how to do it. And so in my view, somehow we stop teaching those skills. How do you sit with someone who's grieving? How do you sit with someone who's depressed? And more of us, I would say in the grieving case, we're involved in some sort of religious congregation. And so if you're Jewish and someone is grieving, you wouldn't think the obvious thing to do is like go to a party for the next week. But sitting Shiva is a brilliant way to help somebody through the first stages of grieving.
Right.
You give them something to do, you're surrounded by people, you got lots of community. And so I think that institutionalized a way of dealing with each other. And so to me, one of the ways out of it, which is not to minimize the other problems, is to get really good at the skills of making the other person feel seen, respected, and heard.
Absolutely. You know, I think a little about this through the prism of your last book, Second Mountain, which is also a brilliant book. If you haven't read it, you should. But you talk about how your own focus is shifting from a culture of individual achievement to understanding something about a culture of participation, a life of participation, of caring about others. And it feels to me that that's another way of saying what you're saying, is that we've lived in a society that has absolutely valorized individual achievement over everything else, and it's gotten worse over the last 40 years.
Yeah, and so one of the things I did starting in 2017, I started something called Weave, the Social Fabric Project, which is about community builders.
Right.
And so we would go around the country and we'd just go to a town and say, who's trusted here? And people would start giving us names, and often they're the same names.
Wow.
And you can never tell who those people are. Like there's a neighborhood in DC called Columbia Heights. And we said, who's trusted here? And they pointed us to the guy who took the money at the parking garage in the neighborhood. And he happened to have an obsession with city zoning rules. So if you had a problem with the city, you went to the guy in the parking garage, and he's like a node of his community. He's trusted. Ann and I are friends with a guy named Pancho Arguelles, who was in Houston, or still is in Houston, but he used to run something called the Living Hope Wheelchair Association. And we take men who've been paralyzed by construction accidents, give them wheelchairs, diapers, catheters, help them, train them to become social workers. So you're in Houston and a bunch of Latino guys wheel in your neighborhood to help your neighborhood. And I once said to Pancho, you know, you radiate holiness. And he just said, no, I reflect holiness. And so those are people whose lives are dedicated to community. But one of the things I concluded from my own part was words like community and relationship are abstract. What is the actual act of building a relationship? It's the actual act of knowing how to pace a conversation.
Yeah.
It's the actual act of knowing how to reveal vulnerability at an appropriate speed.
Yeah.
It's the actual act of asking questions.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to get in the nitty-gritty of what relationship community really is, which is a discrete set of small social encounters.
Yeah. It's interesting because you say morality can only be understood relationally. It's not something that you can have individually. Which reminds me of your favorite 19th century philosopher, Karl Marx, who said that the smallest human unit is two, not one. That what actually constitutes morality is what happens between us.
Yeah. Marx actually had a lot. I'm going to tell you one story just so I give you a little credibility in your eyes.
Thank God.
So I growing up here in Stuyvesant Town, and my dad's teaching at NYU, and they're somewhat left-wing. And so in late 1960s, hippies would go to Central Park, and they had a thing called the Be-In, which was they would go just to be. And one of the things the hippies did was they put a garbage can on fire, and they threw their wallets into it to demonstrate their liberation from money and material things. And I was 5, and I saw a $5 bill on fire in the garbage can, so I broke from the crowd, reached into the fire, grabbed the money, and ran away. And that was my first step over to the right. But at least I grew up in a solidly left-wing household.
Do you know the story about me burning cash?
No.
No, we won't go into that. But yes, that's actually one of my formative stories, was the opposite, burning all the money in my wallet as a protest.
Wow.
It was insane. Oh. We have a couple of questions
Parallel
from
lives. There will be a questionnaire, who was right?
Well, you know, I just have to actually acknowledge that one of the things I love about this, Dave, one of the things I love about you is that you're somebody who has a very different political perspective than I do. And yet I just, something like I care about you and like you so much. I admire you. I love the way you think. And it's such a balm to me to find somebody who identifies with other political ideals who I can feel that way about. It's really...
This is when I should have a play. I could say, would you mind producing this?
There's a couple of questions from the audience, and there's two that seem to me very similar. How do you remain calm and compassionate towards someone even during arguments? And how do I not give up on friends who are self-absorbed and don't know how to ask questions?
Yeah. So on the first question, when obviously we now have a lot of argument in our lives.
Yeah.
And when I walk into a room, I come associated with the New York Times, the Atlantic, PBS, Yale, if you know me, the Aspen Institute. Right. I come with a lot of elite baggage. And so often I'm, from the left and the right, I'm the focus of some critique. I'm part of systems that people think are rotten. And so my first instinct is to be defensive. And which say, hey, I'm a good guy. I'm not the problem here. You should know this.
Right.
But I've since learned that when somebody's critiquing me, my job is to stand in their standpoint. It's to ask them 3 or 4 or 5 times in different ways, tell me more about what you think. Tell me more, what am I missing here? What am I missing here? And first, you learn a lot. If you ask the same question 4 or 5 times, the 5th answer is very much better and very different than the first answer.
Right.
And then the other thing you're doing is you're showing respect. And so there's a great book I recommend called Crucial Conversations by a whole bunch of authors led by a guy named Joseph Grenny. And they say that in any conversation, respect is like air. When it's present, nobody notices. But when it's absent, it's all anybody can think about.
Right.
And so they say every conversation has the thing we're nominally talking about, but the real conversation is the underflow of emotion that's going between us.
Oh, that's so good.
So with everything I say, I'm either making you feel more safe or less safe, more respected or less respected. Right. So pay attention to that under conversation.
Right.
And so if I can show that level of respect and curiosity, we may not agree, but we'll respect each other, and we'll have a good relationship. A couple other things which I got from conversation experts. One is to find the gem statement. Right. So if you and I are disagreeing about, I don't know, whatever, Karl Marx, and we may disagree about that, but we both love America and want what's best for America. If we keep that gem statement in the center, then we preserve our relationship amid a disagreement.
Yeah.
And then the final one is find the disagreement under the disagreement. Right. And this is a Talmudic rule. Like when 2 scholars are debating, they have more, you can debate, that's fine. But it's more fun to say, why are we disagreeing? Like what's the deep? Yeah. And so then we're on a joint exploration. Now as for what to do with self-absorbed assholes, how do you have a conversation? I must say that is a problem. Which and I mean, any relationship has got to be reciprocal.
Yeah.
And so I guess I've sometimes tried lead with a little curiosity, ask a question, maybe you'll lead with curiosity back. Lead with maybe a slight vulnerability, see if you have answer back. Yeah. But at some point, some people are just like, boom.
Yeah.
And I live in Washington, so the most emotionally avoidant city on the face of the earth. And I tell this story in the book. I was on the phone with a friend of mine. He's a friend, sort of. And he was serving the Obama White House. And we're talking, and I'm on my cell, and the call drops. And I think, okay, he'll notice the call drops. He'll call me back. So I wait 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, 8 minutes. And I finally call his office, and I talk to his assistant. She says, oh, he can't talk. He's on the phone. And so I say, he's on the phone with me. He does not understand that our call dropped 10 minutes ago. And so when you got a bloviator like that,
it's hard.
My only rule is we will not be enjoying each other's company again. So like,
but the thing, I just want to say, the examples you've talked about earlier and what you talk about in the book, that most of us come to a point in life where we realize that the models that worked for us earlier are not working anymore, and we have the ability to change those models. That seems to me inherent in a lot of what you talk about here. Yes, there are terrible bloviators, but don't assume they can't change. Right. They may prove they can't change, or they may prove they're not going to change now.
Right.
But you don't harden that into the certainty that they can't.
Now you're sounding like the Pope. Now we're getting to religious territory here.
Well, actually, okay, I'll skip to that question because it's a very good one. Do you think being more secular as a society has contributed to the sadness and emptiness that we feel?
I would say religious people, and I'm one, talk a lot about morality and goodness, and you'd think religious people would therefore be a lot better than non-religious people, but that has not been my life experience. And especially when you look at some of the evangelical churches today, it's not literally you would not go by the data and think, wow, they're really filled with compassion for diversity. Right. But I do think the loss of congregations has been bad for America. Right. I think it's just the fact of people, like I said, when somebody in a community dies, a congregation knows what to do. And so a friend may or may not know what to do. Yeah. And so I think the loss of congregational life has been bad, just because it's social capital.
Well, it's back to the Putnam thesis that our loss of civic institutions impoverishes us and leaves us in our internet silos. Yeah. I have to make sure I get this one in because I like this question. I'm Pedro. How and when did you find your passion? I'm 15 and have no clue of what I want to do. Any wisdom to share?
Okay. So I have a concept called the Annunciation moment, which is the moment that sometimes happens early in life that prefigures all the rest. And so I mentioned I read Paddington the Bear when I was 7, decided to become a writer. My daughter, when she was 5, she walked into a hockey rink and just felt at home. And now she coaches hockey out in California.
Wow.
I'm not comparing my daughter and I to Einstein, but Einstein's dad gave him a compass when he was 4. And he saw, hidden forces in the universe are pushing this needle around. Right. I want to study hidden forces of the universe.
Right.
And so some of us are very lucky, and that happens early on. We know why we're put on this earth.
And now Pedro's 15.
Pedro's 15. So how do you do that? Here I would say a few things. One, and this I got from Nietzsche, which is write 4 great experiences you had in your life and see if you can draw a thematic line through them. And Nietzsche says, then you will discover your law of your very nature. Mm-hmm. Another, which I'm quoting people because other people are smarter than me, Viktor Frankl. So he says, when you're trying to find your passion in life, the worst question you can ask is, what's my passion in life? Or what do I want from life? The right question is, what is life asking me to do? And so what problem is out there that is calling on me to solve it? And I keep quoting people, Frederick Buechner was a great novelist. He said, you find your calling where your deep gladness, if I can remember this correctly, where your deep gladness meets the world's deep need. Yeah. And so I think the short thing for Pedro is go out and find problems. Don't look, the passion will come once you find the problem. And once you find a problem or some injustice or some wrong or some gap that you're interested in,
strikes you,
and then you commit yourself to it, the passion will come later. Yeah. But don't think you're going to start with passion and then the passion will come in the doing. And you probably won't find passion sitting in some office somewhere. You got to go out to where the problems are. Yeah. And so I once gave this advice to a young woman who went to Swanee, a school in Tennessee. She said, I quit my job and I'm walking around the city looking for a problem. I'm like, don't take me that literally. But those are some random thoughts. But thank you, Pedro, for the question. And relax. You're 15. I remember when I was 15, I was in a panic. What am I going to do with my life? But my goal, I would say one thing to you, in your 20s, the way to think about your 20s, just do 3 random ass things. So like my son, my eldest son, was a baseball coach. He taught kindergarten in Nairobi, and he served in the Israeli Defense Forces. And so he spent his 20s doing 3 really different things, and he feels behind, because some of his friends went right into something, and they're ahead. Yeah. I said, no, that's the right thing to do. Do 3 radically different things, and you've experienced a lot of things in life, and you sort of know a little better where you want to go. And there's no sense rushing through your 20s.
Yeah. You know, if I could just, forgive me, Pedro, but that struck me. So if I could just add to that. The only other thing I'd say is that you do want to cultivate the ability to get better at something. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the thing you're going to end up doing, but to do something that's hard and practice it and find yourself getting better at it gives you a kind of confidence and awareness that you can apply to other things as well. But you have to believe that you don't need to be fully born able to do the thing that you're going to do. You're going to have to learn how to do it, and developing the confidence that you're going to be able to learn how to do it. That you're going to be able.
Yeah,
that
that's very
feels very
valuable.
important too.
Yeah, yeah.
Can you develop the ability of knowing others if in your childhood you were not known or seen? Therefore, your learned experience is different.
Yeah, that's a very good and poignant question. Now, there's a saying in psychology, you can only have the kinds of relationships you've experienced. But I don't think that precludes you from growing into a very wise and seeing person. If we look at some of the people who have become great novelists, a lot of them had truly awful childhoods and no one paid attention. They developed amazing insight into others. And I do think there are moments in a life, sometimes moments of suffering, where one of my favorite sayings about suffering is you can either be broken by it or broken open by it. You either cover yourself over or you open up. And one of my favorite passages is by a theologian named Paul Tillich, who was prominent in the 50s, that suffering interrupts your life and reminds you you're not the person you thought you were. It carves into the floor of what you thought was the basement of your soul and reveals a cavity, and it carves through that floor and reveals a cavity below. Mm-hmm. So you just see deeper into yourself. And when you do that, you realize that only spiritual and relational food will solve that, will fill those cavities. And so it's the act of just becoming, even in a dangerous world, becoming even more open, that I think brings forth the burst of humanistic growth. Even if you haven't experienced it. And then you become capable of having, just because you weren't loved as a kid doesn't mean you can't love someone else as an adult. There's nothing baked into ourselves, I think every developmental psychologist would agree, there's nothing baked into ourselves at 21 that can't be changed.
Yeah.
Like the early years are important, but that doesn't mean you're sentenced by whatever happened to you.
They're not your destiny.
Yeah, it's simply not true.
You have a beautiful quote from Thornton Wilder. In love's service, only the wounded soldiers can serve.
Yeah.
Which feels to me like it's just true, and we've experienced it ourselves, and we've seen other people experience it, that great damage either narrows you down or it opens you up.
Yeah.
And that's a choice. It's not an easy choice, but it is something you have some power over.
Yeah. And I find that when you're in one of life's valleys, it's very hard to climb out yourself, but you need somebody else to reach in and help you out. And that act of reaching in is an act of great love and care, and it creates this sense of attachment to and a greater capacity to love.
And it's infectious. If you reach out, you've described this about vulnerability. If you make yourself vulnerable, it's astonishing what that evokes from other people. Yeah. Other people surprise you. Yeah. If you reach out and help people, it's astonishing what you get back from that. Yeah.
I was at a bar somewhere on this tour, in a hotel bar, doing what you would call sad guy drinking alone, but which I call reporting. And I'm scrolling through Twitter, and we all know the images that have been on there for the last couple months. And I come across a video of James Baldwin, and it's an interview he gave in the 60s. And he says, the world is held together by the love of relatively few people, which is interesting. I'm not sure I agree. But then he said, remember when you walk down the street, that person you're seeing, that could be you. You could be that person. Each person you see could be you. You could be that wonderful person. You could be that rotten person. And the question is, will you make that choice? And what struck me about that Baldwin interview, amidst all the horror of all that's on Twitter for the last few months, was here was a guy whose life, because of his race, had been buffeted by racism, bigotry, hostility. It was a tough.
Yeah.
And it would have been easy to become calloused over.
Absolutely.
And yet here was, the phrase that leapt to mind was defiant humanism. He was going to be defiantly humanistic. He was going to be open to that person down the street, that could be you. And he was not going to be judgmental. He was not going to divide the world into 2 parts of people or 6 parts of people. He was going to be a defiant humanist in the face of bitterness.
Yeah.
And it struck me that's sort of an inspiration for those of us who are living through this moment.
He's astonishing in this moment, returning to Baldwin, who, and also his sexuality was, of course, he suffered so much from that. But one of the things I loved about him is he would always say that racism is more of a problem for white people than it is for black people, because what it does to their souls is worse. And that, in a way, is a criticism, and in a way is an invitation to brotherhood. I mean, it's astonishing. David Brooks, How to Know a Person. It's an extraordinary book. You're an extraordinary man. Buy all the others, read all the others, and thank you for sharing the time.
Thank you, Oskar.